Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into the Ukraine conflict. Things are, they've taken a pretty sharp turn lately. You've probably seen the news about the U.S. sending those long-range missiles over to Ukraine, the ATACMS. They're
Yeah.
not just sitting around anymore, they're actually being used.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. I mean, not just because of the raw power they bring to the fight, but also because it signals a change in the overall strategy, both for Ukraine and for the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you think about it, Ukraine has been asking for these missiles for months. I remember reading articles where their military leaders were practically pleading for them, saying they needed that extra reach to really hit back effectively against Russia. So what was the holdup? Why the hesitation from the U.S. and then what changed?
That's a great question. Although the U.S. has been trying to find the right balance. They want to support Ukraine, of course. But they've also been worried about provoking Russia too much, sending these long-range missiles. Well, there was always a concern that it might be seen as a major escalation. And, that could potentially lead to a much wider conflict.
That makes sense. So what was the tipping point? Why is now the right time for the ATACMS to come into play?
That's tough to say for sure. But there are probably a few things happening at the same time. For one, Ukraine's counteroffensive, well, it hasn't been as successful as some people had hoped. So there's this growing sense that they need more help, that they need the tools to really push back against Russia.
Okay, I can see that. So let's get into the specifics then. What exactly is it about these ATACMS that makes them such a potential game changer? What can they do that other weapons systems just can't?
Okay, well, imagine this. Imagine you're in a fight, and your opponent can suddenly punch twice as far as you can. That's kind of what the ATACMS do for Ukraine. They can hit targets over 165 kilometers away. That's way beyond the range of anything they had before.
Wow, 165 kilometers. So we're talking about striking deep into Russian-held territory. Like I read that one of the first targets hit was an airbase in the Zaporizhia region.
Yeah.
That's right in the heart of the conflict zone, isn't it?
It is. That region is crucial for Russia's control of the entire southern front. By hitting targets there, Ukraine is basically saying, hey, nowhere is safe anymore.
So we could be talking about disrupting supply lines, taking out command centers, maybe even going after those S-400 air defense systems that Russia's been making such a big deal about.
Absolutely. These missiles give Ukraine the ability to go after the core of Russia's military operations.
Okay, so for the Ukrainians, this has got to be a huge morale boost, knowing that they can finally hit back with some serious force.
Oh, definitely. But you have to look at it from the other side, too. Russia is now facing a whole new level of vulnerability. Their logistics, their planning, everything has to be reevaluated in light of this new threat.
And it's not just the physical threat either. There's a psychological impact, too. Just knowing that these missiles are out there, that at any moment a key asset could be taken out, that's got to weigh heavily on the minds of Russian commanders.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
It introduces this whole new level of uncertainty and anxiety. And that can be just as effective as any physical damage.
So it sounds like it's not just about the explosions themselves. It's about the strategic implications, the shift in momentum, the psychological pressure that comes with having these long-range weapons in play.
Exactly. And that's why this development is being watched so closely around the world.
Okay, so we've established that these ATCMS are a big deal. But before we go too far down that road, I think it's important to also consider the limitations.
You're absolutely right. These missiles are powerful, but they're not a magic solution.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, I've seen reports that some of the missiles were actually intercepted by Russian air defenses.
That's true. Russia has invested heavily in their air defense systems, especially the S-400.
And if I understand it correctly, those S-400s are designed to take down exactly these kinds of targets, high-altitude, fast-moving missiles like the ATACMS.
Exactly. They combine powerful radars and long-range missiles to create this kind of defensive shield. It's a serious threat, and Ukraine is going to have to find ways to deal with it.
So it's almost like a high-stakes chess match. Ukraine makes a move with these long-range missiles, but Russia has counter-moves ready.
That's a good way to put it. And that's why we have to be careful about oversimplifying things. The ATACMS give Ukraine a new capability, but it doesn't automatically mean they'll win every engagement.
Right. So for everyone listening, this is not a simple story of good guys getting a new weapon and suddenly winning the war. This is a complex conflict with many layers, and these new missiles just add another layer of complexity.
That's important to remember. There will be successes and there will be setbacks.
And on that note, I think it's crucial to remember the human cost of this war. While we're talking about the technicalities of these weapons, There are real people whose lives are being directly impacted by this conflict every single day.
You're absolutely right. The tragedy unfolding in Ukraine is a constant reminder of what's at stake.
So let's keep that in mind as we continue this deep dive. We've talked about the strategic significance of these ATACMS and some of the limitations, but what about the global reaction? How has the world responded to this development? Let's unpack that next.
Yeah, well, it's been interesting, to say the least. You've got some countries that are firmly on Ukraine's side. They're praising the U.S. for finally stepping up and giving Ukraine the support they need to defend themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. Those countries have been urging the U.S. to take a stronger stance for quite a while now.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, you have other countries that are much more hesitant. They're worried that this whole thing could escalate out of control and maybe even drag NATO into a direct conflict with Russia.
I've heard those concerns from some analysts as well. The idea that this could provoke Russia to retaliate in a way that just spins out of control.
Exactly. And it's not just governments we have to think about. Public opinion within those countries is probably divided too. Some people see it as a moral obligation, to support a country fighting for its freedom. But then others might be more focused on avoiding a larger war at all costs.
It's a complex situation for sure. And, it's easy to get caught up in the military and political aspects of all this. But at the end of the day, there are real people whose lives are on the line. Speaking of which, we've talked about the S-400s a few times now. For those of us who aren't exactly military experts, what makes these air defense systems so tough to deal with?
Well, think of it this way. They're basically Russia's shield against anything coming at them from the sky. They can detect and intercept all sorts of threats, from aircraft to ballistic missiles. And when it comes to the ATCMS, the S-400 is a serious obstacle. It has the range and the firepower to potentially shoot those missiles down before they ever reach their targets.
Okay, so how does that even work? I mean, we're talking about missiles traveling at incredibly high speeds. How can the S-400 possibly keep up with them, let alone intercept them?
It's a combination of things. They use very advanced radar technology and incredibly sophisticated algorithms. The S-400's radar can pick up incoming missiles from hundreds of kilometers away. That gives the system enough time to figure out the trajectory and then launch its own interceptor missiles.
So it's like a super high-tech game of catch, except the stakes are just a little bit higher in this case.
That's one way to think about it. And just like in any game of catch, there's always a chance that someone's going to miss.
Okay.
No air defense system is perfect, and that includes the S-400.
Right. So are there ways for Ukraine to counter these defenses? I mean, are there tactics or technologies they can use to give their missiles a better chance of getting through?
Well, there are definitely options. One approach is to try to overwhelm the S-400, launch multiple missiles at the same time. If you do it right, it makes it much harder for the system to track and intercept all of them. Another option is to use electronic warfare to jam the radar. You can essentially blind the system that way and create those little windows of vulnerability.
So it's not just a matter of firing off these ATACMS and hoping for the best. There's a whole strategy behind how they're used, how they're targeted, and how they can be protected from enemy defenses.
Absolutely. It really becomes a battle of wits at that point, with each side trying to outsmart the other.
So let's imagine for a moment, Ukraine manages to get their ATACMS past the S-400s and they hit their targets. What kind of impact can we realistically expect to see on the battlefield? Would this be a decisive shift in momentum, or is it more complicated than that?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it's reasonable to expect that these missiles could disrupt Russia's war effort in some significant ways. For one thing, it forces Russia to be a lot more cautious about how they position their troops, their equipment, their supplies.
That makes sense. If you know that anything you put out in the open could be targeted from 100 miles away, you're going to think twice about how you deploy your resources.
Exactly. It introduces this element of uncertainty and risk that can really slow down their decision-making. And it can definitely make them think twice about launching any major offensives. And then beyond the immediate impact on the battlefield, there's the psychological effect to consider as well. Knowing that they're vulnerable to these long-range strikes can really wear down the morale of Russian troops and commanders.
So it's not just about the physical damage, it's about the mental pressure, the constant fear of being within range of those missiles.
Exactly. And sometimes that psychological impact can be just as powerful as any physical weapon.
But even with all that said, it seems unlikely that these ATCMS alone will be enough to win the war for Ukraine.
I agree. This conflict is just too complex to be decided by any single weapon, no matter how powerful. The ATACMS can definitely give Ukraine an edge, but in the end, the outcome is going to depend on so many other factors. The resilience of the Ukrainian people, the continued support of their allies, the decisions made by leaders on both sides.
So for anyone listening who's trying to make sense of this whole situation, what's the key takeaway here? What should we be focusing on as this conflict continues to unfold?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is not a static situation. Things are constantly changing. The ATACMS have added a new layer of complexity, but it's just one piece of a much larger and very intricate puzzle. We need to stay informed, we need to be careful about oversimplifying things, and we need to be prepared for the unexpected.
And I would add to that, we can't forget about the human cost of this war.
Absolutely. In the midst of all the talk about strategy and weapons and geopolitics, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that real people are suffering, lives are being lost every day, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered the reactions from around the world. We've delved into the capabilities and the limitations of these ATACMS. What else do we need to consider?
Well, there's one aspect of this that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the ethical dimension.
You mean the moral implications of using these kinds of long-range weapons?
Exactly. Because with greater range comes greater responsibility.
You know, it's amazing to me how this one weapons system, these ATACMS, it's really sparked such a broad discussion. We've gone from, battlefield tactics to global politics to even ethical questions, all in one deep dive.
Yeah, it shows you how connected everything really is, especially in a conflict like this. Every decision, even something like sending these missiles, it creates these ripples that can spread out in so many directions.
It really does, and it makes you think, what happens next? What are some of the possible scenarios now that these ATACMS are in play?
Well, one possibility is that they do exactly what Ukraine is hoping for. Give them the edge they need to make some real progress in their counteroffensive. If they can disrupt Russia's logistics and command structure, it could shift the balance of power on the battlefield.
And that could put more pressure on Russia to negotiate a settlement, right? If they're losing ground and their position is getting weaker, maybe they'd be more willing to come to the table.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. But then there's also the risk that Russia could dig in even deeper. They might become even more aggressive and maybe even escalate the conflict in a way that puts everyone at greater risk.
I think that's what a lot of people are worried about, that this could lead to a much wider war,
Yeah.
that maybe even NATO gets pulled into a direct confrontation with Russia.
It's a legitimate concern. And it shows you how delicate the situation is. Policymakers have to walk this very fine line, trying to support Ukraine without triggering a larger conflict.
So we're in uncharted territory now, both in terms of the opportunities and the dangers. What are the things we should be watching for to see which way this is going to go?
Well, a lot depends on how Russia responds. Do they just kind of absorb this new development and adapt their tactics? Or do they lash out and escalate things?
And on the Ukrainian side, how effectively can they use these ATACMS, and how well can they adapt to whatever countermeasures Russia might come up with?
That's right. And then, of course, there's the international dimension. Will Ukraine's allies continue to provide the same level of support, especially if Russia starts to escalate things?
So it's complicated, lots of moving parts and no easy answers. So for our listeners, the folks who've been with us on this deep dive, what's the main thing they should keep in mind as we move forward?
I think the biggest thing is to remember that this is not a static situation. It's constantly changing. The ATACMS have added a new dimension, but it's just one piece of a much bigger picture. So stay informed, stay engaged, and be prepared for the unexpected.
Great advice. And for me, this whole conversation has really highlighted the need for nuanced thinking. We can't oversimplify things. We have to remember that there are multiple perspectives, and there are no easy solutions.
I agree completely, and that's something we should strive for in everything we do, not just when we're talking about the Ukraine conflict, but in how we approach any complex issue.
That's a great point. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of ATACMS and the Ukraine conflict. We've covered a lot of ground today, explored some really challenging questions, and hopefully we've all come away with a little bit better understanding of what's at stake.
It's been a pleasure being here.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking those tough questions. We'll see you on our next deep dive.